Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 470th New Social Environment. I'm Ty, the Senior Production Assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Jamaal Peterman and Zoë Hopkins. We are thrilled to welcome the poet Noland here, who will read to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you all to check the chat in just a moment for a living document of resources and actions. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Jamaal Peterman received his MFA at Pratt Institute and BFA from the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. He has been included in exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art, Public Art Fund, the University of Chicago, Kavi Gupta, and James Fuentes. Peterman has undertaken residencies at MASS MoCA, Wassaic Project Residency, and Fountainhead Residency. His current show, White Roads on Black Soil, follows Peterman's first exhibition at the gallery, Grunch In Bed, and his online exhibition, Tales from the Hood, both held in 2020. Writer Zoë Hopkins studies art history and African American studies at Harvard University. Her writing has appeared in Hyperallergic, the Brooklyn Rail, and Whitehot magazine of contemporary art. Please take it away, Zoë.
Thank you, Ty, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be in conversation with Jamaal today, and want to say, first of all, Jamaal, congratulations on your show. It really is such a rich and provocative installation, and you must be just really thrilled. Really, I really encourage everyone to see the show while it's up. I believe it closes at the end of the week. Is that right?
Yeah, on the 15th, Saturday. Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely encourage everyone to head to the Lower East Side to James Fuentes and see Jamaal's work if they have the time and ability. Of course, you know, COVID has complicated those possibilities, but it really is worthwhile. But anyways, thank you so much, Jamaal, for being here today and for being in dialogue. I wanted to begin with a question about temporality and the sense of time in your works. So as I'm sure everyone will notice, Jamaal's works are united by these really rich, vibrant hues, and color is such an important part of your work, Jamaal. And looking at color, I was reminded of sort of Afrofuturist visuality, particularly thinking about, you know, Sun Ra or even Afrocobra. There really is a kind of futurity to your works and the sense of color that they carry. And then also from a formal perspective, there seems to be a sort of utopian futurism in the modular abstractions that you're using. I was sort of reminded of Malevich and European suprematism, which is very much attached to these ideas of a utopia. But then there's also something extremely sort of nostalgic in your body of work, a sort of childish playfulness, and also a kind of deeply haunting sense to your figures, which are rendered in this kind of translucent way that seems to be almost of the past or kind of ghostly. So this is a very long-winded way of asking. I'd just love to hear from you about how time figures into your works. Where are they situated in time? Yeah, I open it to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the great conversation. Yeah, it's a lot of the work is fractured and it's like temporal moments. And I'm glad that you hit on a lot of different spots because the work is very dense and it's layered. You know, you got the flatness, you have the color, you have the texture, you have the surreal images that kind of function in there. But when I started thinking about color as a function to pretty much display culture, you know, thinking about the future, thinking about this utopia, thinking about this surreal nature, about the joy of being in an environment the cleanness, the happiness that you pretty much produce when you are walking through that area, and basically a different side of culture that's more so on the ground other than looking at outside in a box. And this is kind of how I frame the subject, because these are temporal fracture moments of scenes that play out through history, not just the present, but the past and the future. So trying to develop this idea of or context that kind of allowed everybody to enter the scene, but feel a part of it. But it's kind of, these colors do have a bit of a sinister approach to it, because the information and the content that I do talk about is very direct, and thinking about the landscape and how we all move through it and how reflected in our situation. So I like to use this analogy when I talk about my color in this type of way, and thinking about pretty much every species on the planet, almost every species on the planet, especially if it's a dangerous species, is colorful. It's bright, it's alluring. You want to touch it, you want to grab it, you want to enter the space of it. But as soon as you touch it, most of the time it's poisonous, and then you get this reaction from it. So a lot of the information and content is an attraction beacon for people to enter the work, just to get an understanding of the content in which I'm talking about. Like within this body of work, I'm talking about residential segregation. So I'm allowing people to enter it, but also be careful for the information, because we're moving through these zones and we don't realize what's actually happening around us. And this is pretty much the beginning of this story, or what I'm telling in this work. I'm walking through Florida, Baltimore, Maryland, New York, and a lot of people are moving through these environments and don't really understand how they became and how they're freely walking in this environment. So I'm trying to bring that history of the past to the present, of this free moving, but how this landscape is shaped. So I'm using this color, using these surreal functions, using this flatness to pretty much help direct people on impact, directiveness from the flatness, the surreal moment of this third dimensional space, and really the color to help people enter the space with a visual element of touching or wanting to grasp, and then hitting them with a punch.
Yeah, and there is, of course, that really fabulous textural dimension to your works, where you're using sand and glitter, and all of these, kind of playful, evocative materials that do kind of have this effect of pulling the viewer into the painting and into the picture plane. And that's something else that I kind of wanted to dive into, is just your negotiation of depth and dimensionality, because there are several ways in which elements in the compositions seem to rise above the picture plane, whether it's through the textural dimensions that I just alluded to, or also, of course, in the trompe l'oeil that you're using to paint the figures, which I think is really interesting, especially when you compare it with the kind of rigid flatness of the more kind of abstract elements of your paintings, the more kind of modular sense that predominates your scenes. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how depth and perspective function in your works. And there's, lots of language that you use around sort of world building and having portals, and the painting functioning as this kind of reality, but also hyper reality. So I'm sort of interested in how depth and perspective play upon this idea of a real world or a false world or a portal. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I'm like always been thinking about the dreamscape and the surreal nature. And just thinking about reality in itself and thinking pretty much understanding or trying to understand this matrix that we move in, and how is that layered. And a lot of my works are like a sandwich layer effect. It's the mid-ground, the background, mid-ground, foreground. And I kind of use those as these moments of these moments where each layer, like pretty much we're all when we walk through the land, we are part of everything. We're not separate from anything. So I want to show this breakdown of elements just to show how important it is and how we kind of move through these environments. So I kind of start, like I said earlier, I start with the background, the flatness, and then I work my way through the framing section. And that's pretty much showing that we are pretty much showing the landscape, but how do you break the landscape down into a surreal element that we can pretty much start to feel a part of? And this is where you get this 3D trompe l'oeil frame network. And once you have that moment where people can enter or feel, when you approach the work, you feel implicit to being a part of it, because you have this cement or this layer of sidewalk that's under there. Now the body feels a part of the environment, not just the figuration, but the actual body walking past the painting. And then that last layer, well, you can kind of count these as 2 layers, but you think about the figuration of the being, the form of it, but the form doesn't equate to anything until you put the shadow into it. So the shadow causes that extra layer. And this brings now the dreamscape, or this unconscious moment from the viewer, and also in the work, that we share this same space. So when you have those, the last element, or this 3-dimensional, or this 4th type of section, is the texture. And the texture is a physical placement of weight on the painting. So you have that coupled with all the other, because the whole painting is flat. At the end of the day, even we're using these forms, it's still a flat object. So the texture is just a reflection of weight. And most of the time, the content is reflected on the texture. And I'm using I'm putting the cement texture or this in certain areas to reference the weight on a flat surface, comparative to where the figure is or where the structures are, and how that weight is on top of that being or that function, or how much gravity does it have in perspective to the overall landscape. So that's kind of how it's playing, just more so thinking that how do we see each dimension? Because when we're walking, we're in our own heads. Our mind is moving our body, and we're kind of just walking through the environment, not really etching in on how everything is functioning on a macro and micro scale. So this whole synthesis in my paintings is showing the macro, the micro, all put together. And it just takes a little bit of time, because it's a dialogue that I have to build over time, just to get people to understand how each layer functions, and how the forms move, and what are the structures, and how they're placed in the environment.
Wow, it's so amazing to hear you describe your process in depth like that. And I had been wondering, when I went to see the show, what came first and what came last, and how these elements collude to fashion a world. And I love what you have to say about flatness too. And flatness not necessarily being kind of like held apart from weight. These things can coexist, and flatness can be kind of vibrational and textural, and is not reducible necessarily to 2-dimensionality. And is surreal itself. And I've been thinking so much too about the kind of surreality of your works, and one thing that a sort of visual frame of reference that I feel like is really important to your work is almost like the virtual realm or cyberspace a little bit. And you see that in particular in Walking Through Another Experiment, where you have these kind of 8-bit grid forms, this kind of computerized digital sensibility. And I've been thinking a lot about Legacy Russell's glitch feminism, and this whole idea of the glitch as a kind of way of articulating refusal or resistance in virtual and digital space. And I just wanted to hear from you a little bit about the extent to which you are interfacing with the virtual and the digital, and how that's showing up in your work and in the architectures that you're building. Because I do think of digital space as a kind of like highly architectural domain. And it is, of course, fraught with many of the tensions that your work is drawing on with regards to race and class and gender. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the significance of virtual or digital culture and imagery in your body of work.
Yeah, particularly in this painting, I like how you broke that down, because now it's kind of starting to buzz in my head and think about the beginning of when I thought of this work. And you have this mechanical, you have this grid or this mechanical or these chips or like the circuit board, but you also, the main reason why I started doing this is, I was flying in a plane and looking down on the landscape, and also walking through the landscape when I was in Pratt, and my studio was an MFA studio was right next to Marcy projects, Marcy Public Housing, and thinking about the structure and why it was built. And when I started to go online and look at these maps, these aerial view maps of these sections, because now we're still using technology to even be able to see that space and how they gridded it and how it functions as a circuit board, how it functions as these complex geometric forms. But what does these geometric forms allude to, and how they're constructed in the segment of housing? So it all kind of placed in that function of grids, and then you have the motherboard or these chips, and then the placement of the structures and what they're used for and how they're gridded in the environment. And when I pretty much did this work, it really, you don't know sometimes, and this is why, going back to the frame, you don't really know, or you don't really see when you're walking through these environments. It's like people only place judgment outside looking in, but when you're in these environments, it's beautiful, because this is how you're born. This is what you see every day. So this is, like, again, allude to these colors again, it's just like, it's beauty inside of all of that, regardless on if you don't see it looking on the outside in. When I grew up and when I walk through this, I still see this type of environment that I grew up in, and I love it. But coming outside and having that moment, really thinking about how these structures were formed, particularly in this work, how these structures are formed, looking at the aerial view of Marcy Public Housing, which kind of thought in my mind, I was like, wow, going back to this this matrix, it almost looked like a Pac-Man game. How these
Yeah,
that's how it kind of first went through, like, how are these people moving through this, and what is Miss Pac-Man, what is Mr. Pac-Man, what are the ghosts, just thinking about that type of segment on, breaking through that that construct of reality and really flattening it out. But looking at this, it really made me think about what was the purpose of this landscape and who was it for. And it kind of break down in this place, or these structures were for middle class whites during a certain period of time. And African Americans weren't allowed to get a federal loan to be in these placements. So in the section in the corner, I have this red line against this brown structure. And that is basically when the FHA and the VA loans finally allow African Americans to come in the structure or in these homes, it was what we call white flight, and that took place. So when we came in there, then the whole system kind of flipped and changed, because we came in and pretty much everybody left, and they were able to charge us more money because we wanted to get away from the bad neighborhoods. We just wanted to be in a peaceful neighborhood. So all of this redlining and all of this play out through the work in the background. And we don't, like I say, I'm doing it because we don't know, or we don't really see it happening because we're just moving through it in like an autonomous way. So I placed all this in there, and then in that section down at the bottom, in the cement area, if we can zoom in, well, they're both changed. So I use that X right there because I'm trying to encode information, symbols, and all types of codes that we can link into, just how you see certain things. Like I said, the geometric grid, the matrix, so what we're ones and zeros or what we're looking into. I'm trying to play around with those ideas and embedding history into text within the cement, something that lasts forever. Like almost when you write down, almost when you're younger and you see wet cement and you write your name in there, and then it's forever engraved history that's been placed in a landscape. So I want to invoke that same feeling of belonging to the landscape, but I'm starting to place symbols that echo reference of how I use that X as a reference of FEMA, and when they came through Hurricane Katrina, and how they marked different subjects on the doors, the place of who came and saved people. The top, what time? The top was what time, who came and saved you. The right corner, how many bodies were found, or if live bodies was in there, and then who was in charge of the section. So I'm using that, and I encoded it in a different way. So I put the things and the times that these placements happen. So on the other side of the blue side, talk about the 1950s when these FHAs and VAs loans were prepared, and then you have a section where I changed it to VA and FA, and then just these placements, so we can start encoding a rich information in a complex system. And sometimes we can't have all of that in one painting, but what I've been trying to do is synthesize these different layers, and each layer can connect to a different subject, if that kind of makes sense.
No, it completely does. And I love this language of encoding that you're using. Because I think, architecture is so often used to obscure realities, right? And obscure histories of racial and class-based terror and exploitation. And what you're doing here with, literally placing language and text into the aerial views of the architecture, you're laying bare the facts of this history, and you are making legible, right, these often obscured histories and contemporary realities, which I find really, really compelling. Just to this point of legibility and readability and grammar, one thing that I'm really compelled by is your unique approach to figuration. And you haven't always used figures in your work, I think. I was looking at some of your past exhibitions at James Fuentes, and it looks like figuration has really become important to you in the past year or two. And so I would love to talk a little bit about why you've turned to figuration, and then also how you arrived at this really unique vocabulary of figuration, where you have these kind of translucent trope-loyal figures, and also your figures are noticeably headless. And so I was hoping to hear a bit more about what motivates the trope-loyal, what motivates the headlessness, and what motivates the translucency as well, and just kind of how we are to imagine these figures activating the space and navigating through it.
Oh yes, I love that. So it's kind of crazy because even in the abstract form, without the figures, I still place the body and the figure within the structure. And that's why pretty much a lot of the structures were brown. So I was basically showing an abstract version of Black culture within assets, bodies, health, and all that in class, just by showing the scale of certain structures next to other, or multiple structures, or multiple sections of these house forms. And those are always a reflection of the body to me. When I started putting the figurative forms in there, it was more, they were a way for a personal narrative to kind of encroach in the environment, but not just my personal narrative. The reason why there's no forms in no physical body in these works and the past works is because anybody that walks in this environment, that wears these clothes and have on these subjects in that particular environment, are subjugated to the same type of reality, within it being police brutality, or being economic development. It's when you're placed in that environment with that on, you share those same common traits. And in my last show, I never had figures in the forms. They just had a hood on, and you couldn't see their face, but they had no hands. But it was, like I say, it was never meant to be a placement, a personal narrative, just more so say you in there or me in there, but the overarching idea that anybody can be in that subject. And I use these different, I call them like these phasing elements, because I want the body to be fluid through this environment and not be completely pushed back by certain things that happen. It's always a way to get out. It's always a way to maneuver. It's always a way to be transparent. And you just almost thinking, it's not the end all be all in that subject or that place. And you need to be flexible enough to maneuver around that space and pretty much phase through certain situations. So that's kind of how they started to form in there on top of the structures. But like I say, I thought about the structures as bodies in the first place. So then I can add another complex narrative over top of it once people understand that the structures represent bodies and represents class and represents scale, and you start to read the background. And then we can push towards the foreground and understand who walks through this environment and what happens when you walk through this environment. But it's not the end all be all, that you are still flexible enough to move around and phase through another reality, because it's not indefinite.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's one really interesting thing about the trope loyal, is that you have these kind of multiple layers of reality, right? Where it almost looks like the figures are part of a different world than the picture plane itself, even though in terms of color, they are kind of one integrated world, right? You have these, we talked earlier about the flatness of the composition, and then you have these figures that are sort of emerging from the picture plane, and it appears to the viewer, right, like the figures are almost of our world, of our reality, and that they've been kind of lifted from the abstractions that you're employing in I guess the background or the middle ground. So that was something, that's a really interesting sort of visual ploy for me as well. And then something else I was thinking about is the way that scale figures into this kind of play between abstraction and figuration, particularly in the 3 large scale works, Walking Through Another Experiment, Black Flight, and 95 South. You have these towering figures, and then the land itself, or rather the architecture, is diminished in scale. The aerial views that you see in the corner are diminished. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you are navigating this sense of scale, right? And what does it do to have these kind of massive monumental figures and then this diminished architecture? Whereas in our world, the actual appearance of architecture is monumental in relation to our bodies. So what does that inversion kind of do? How does it function?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. Just that I guess since it plays so much on depth and perception, but still working on the canvas, and how far these elementary placements of perspective, the thirds and foreground, background, midground, and pretty much just thinking about that scale, just this simplicity of life, but also this complexity of life at the same time. So like going back to surreal nature, this, when you're playing around with this scale, I'm really thinking about what's impactful at the moment of this time reference. And even in 95 South, I'm thinking about the highway and the weight, because now pretty much how did this impact this moment, and how is it still impacting the moment? So these variations of size are reflected of who is this impacting and how is it impacting. And I use this multiple layer texture for these long striations of cement blocks that reference highways. And you think about, we just drive on highways, but when they come through a neighborhood over years, 50, hundreds of years, when they come through neighborhoods, the fumes that give off, the vibration and the noise that happens, how does it affect the population that's in that area? And how does it affect the people? So I want to have that reverberation of texture and color just to start referencing that idea about the people and what we're looking at. Just even thinking about myself walking through New York and hearing the rail, you hear the tracks, you hear the train come through and you see them sparks. Right. What happens? 100 years that that's been in, you live right next to that. What does that mean? You know what I mean? What does that do to your womb as a mother? What does that do to a child? How do you grow up? Just really starting to think about impact of direction and how to formulate those in my painting, or what's important and how does it trickle down over size? Because I'm always thinking about scale, and I'm thinking about relatability. I'm thinking about class. These small things reference to larger things most of the time mean bigger impact, or it could mean reverse to somebody else. So it's a nice play in contrast when I think about that as a form and how it plays in the work.
I really appreciate that answer. And leads me into another question also about materiality. You were talking about, again, the textures in your works and how they sort of make real, right, these problems that are sometimes framed in terms of abstraction, or they feel kind of distant from us. And the texture and materiality in your work really reminds us that these are problems that we are living with, that are on the ground with us. And I know that sand and glitter play really important and decisive roles in your body of work. And I wanted to ask why you chose those materials.
Yeah, it's in the beginning. Well, I mean, I'm still using them in the same context, but the sand is almost like cement. It's like a base layer of cement. It's like sand, like aggregate, and you have the binder. So it's the same reference of the material. I was using it for the sidewalk because I wanted to reference the sidewalk as an actual form and use the same material, as material reflects content as the work grows, So even with the glitter, when I started to make the work earlier, I wanted to reference clothing when I had no forms in there. And I was trying to breaking down layers and thinking about when I grew up, what was I wearing? If I want to break it down to the simplest form. And I used to wear Sean John and FUBU and Iceberg. And these are clothings that were like, real hip during my time when I was younger. And on the logos, they had vinyl glitter on the logo. So I simplified that even further. And I placed it as the paneling of the work when I had no figures in there to represent clothing and to represent these things, or these, basically, what are the things that make culture in this environment? How are we functioning, and how it's culture, especially Black cultures, is very complex, and it can't be made in one simple form. It's a lot of different narrative that play out, and I'm trying to hit on a lot of those different notes. It may take a little bit of time to read, but eventually the dialogue will be heard, and we'll start to connect the dots so I can push further into the network of what I'm trying to build.
That's so interesting what you're saying about clothing. That's amazing. I totally, so many light bulbs just went off. Okay, that's really interesting. And absolutely, I was thinking also of, glitter has this like obvious connection with, sort of diva culture, pop culture, which is, of course, at the kind of substrate of so many ways that we approach and apprehend Black media is through the image of the diva or the Black icon, and how glitter has been relegated to this realm of the kitsch, or the kind of the tacky, I love how your paintings kind of reclaim that vocabulary to center and legitimize those kind of the kitsch as a playful, but also like really important and pivotal texture in Black culture. So that's amazing to think about. I wanted to ask also about lighting in your works, and particularly in the suite of 3 paintings that are titled Black Male, Dark Blue Car, Blue Light, Black Male, Red Car, Purple Light, and then finally Black Male, Orange Car, Red Light. And you use neon light here to kind of frame or underline or underscore your paintings. And I was, of course, reminded of, the work of Dan Flavin, or so many wonderful abstractionists and conceptual artists who have used neon light as a tool, a device in their artwork. And I wanted to hear from you about, what led you in this direction to this material, and how does it kind of play with or amplify other materialities in your work?
Well, just from that basis of what you saw, that play on art historical reference. But for me, material builds content, and that reflection is like very important for me. And just like I say, again, going back to when I was young, neon lights under your cars were everything, and they still are. And just that reference, besides the relationship between this art historical content, just reflection of culture and what I used to do and how my friends used to move. And like just in the titling this is from my AP. These are works from my APB series, and the APB series reference All Points Bulletin, and it's again with color and reflection of being African American, feeling good and shining, colorful in a nice car in that reference. But these are also beacons for a lot of law enforcement to want to stop you or pull you over. Yeah. And this is where the All Points Bulletin come from, because when they describe you, it's not about who you are, what you did, or what you actually look like. It's a reference of an impactful moment that is your skin color, what color your car is, and what is under it. And anybody can be placed in that structure, in that section, driving. It could be somebody else to who they were trying to get, but you're placed in there just by being in proxy of what we call or proclaim to be swag or fly or cool or driving, sitting low, riding in your car, got your hand out, your hair in the wind, you got your neon lights, and bam, your life can change in a second. And I use these in particular to reference that, because I wanted to talk about that direct, immediate approach and use this flatness and this kitsch with these lights and that brightness to reflect how immediate it is that we see the image and how people perceive it as well in that immediacy. Oh, that's because they're moving that way, and it's impactful that way. So I started off with just thinking about how the material reflected the content and built from there.
Thank you for that answer. And it's also, the light is another way in which you were talking earlier about how things emerge from the picture plane, how there's this kind of restlessness to your compositions wherein nothing remains flat, even though there is this kind of rigid flatness. There is this insistence of playing up the picture plane, playing up three-dimensionality while remaining in the two-dimensional. And the light, I'm thinking of it as almost another trompe-l'oeil, which literally translates to trick of the eye. Right. But it is kind of this external element in the painting that reinforces almost the kind of sculptural dimension that we're witnessing in the picture plane. So I think it is a really nice kind of material interchange that you have happening between the light and the picture plane itself. And that leads me into another thought I was having about the device of the frame in your works, and framing as a kind of mechanism of setting into motion the portal or the simulation. And in some of your other works, you've kind of painted the frame into the canvas, particularly in the large scale works, the frame kind of becomes a participant in the action itself, and it's kind of integrated with the sidewalk. I'm thinking of, walking through Another Experiment, for example, where the figures seem to be almost walking on the bottom portion of the frame. And so I just wanted to hear from you about how framing operates as a device in your paintings. What does it do to kind of situate or defamiliarize the viewer? How does it play upon this notion of the portal? How does it create or reify or deny our sense of reality?
Yeah, that's yeah. I honestly, it kind of depends on, it's so much shaped in the reference of the landscape is so important. The landscape, the background is pretty much the object that we walk in reality and in this world in general. So sometimes that's why sometimes I don't put the figure in the paintings at all, because I want the body to be implicit to the subject. I want people to feel like they're entering the work and they're a participant now. So it's like you're walking through that moment. As soon as you walk past the painting, you're in a fractured moment, which is hence the framing, and it separates that way. and it kind of looked closed off because you have these glittered side panels, but it's just a moment that we are walking through and reflecting on what happened, even if it's for a second. And when the figures get in there, it's more reflective of either a future tense or a present tense on what the body is going to do in the space or how it's moving in the space right now. And they change on what they have on, the position of the body, and what pretty much understanding the landscape of which it's in. So it's needed in some cases, but every work, even thinking about future, every work won't have the frame. It's just to pinpoint a certain subject in a moment, and still like playing around with the idea of how these frames are gridded in this matrix that I'm working with right now. But it all changes. Just if you just think about, on an atomic level, after it comes from cells, you get into this geometric shape, and you get into these type of these decohedron, tetrahedrons, and these squares and these moments that function in a micro level as well. So just bringing it out and blowing up the scale of a cell and the reality of what's behind it is just an interesting play for me. So I will expand that shape of the frame beyond the context of this rectangle or square, but still understanding and just still trying to get some different variables on how can I explore that and take it to the next level and still have people follow along with the information. So, just because I am trying to tell a story, and I don't want people to get too lost in translation, but I do have it's sequential, and it's a story to be told, and it's the present, the past, and the future, because I'm not just asking questions, I'm giving solutions as well.
Yeah. I mean, it all sort of circles back to the original question I asked about temporality. And I think that's another a really pivotal dimension of Black culture, is the kind of coexistence of past, present, and future, right? These things don't exist in separate dimensions. They are all kind of collapsed within each other. And I think your paintings do a really great job of conveying that. And I know for you, some of these are kind of autobiographical, particularly the three large-scale works, Walking Through Another Experiment, Black Flight, and 95 South. They all play on, or play up rather, locations that have been really important to your life and your personal history. So I wanted to kind of walk through that a little bit. I know these cities, the cities that you're looking at here, New York, Baltimore, and then the third
Florida.
city, right.
Florida,
I wanted to just think a little bit about the role of autobiography and storytelling here, because of course these are personal narratives, but you're also telling a much broader history about segregationist politics, about Black migration and fugitivity and settlement, about kind of class politics. And so how do you negotiate that tension between the autobiographical and the collective history, or rather, how do you shatter that binary, that sort of distinction between the personal and the collective? Yeah,
that's interesting, to think of it in that way. And I think this is the whole point of why I'm doing what I'm doing, because regardless of what it is, we still have to move through. We still have to walk. We can't stop. And that's where a lot of them came from, like in 95 South, pretty much that relationship going to when I grew up. I grew up in South Florida. And it's a pretty much reflection of my mom and dad traveling on the highway in order to get to Maryland. So it's kind of just like, just breaking that down and thinking about, 50 or this many years ago, or this, like, that wasn't even a thing. And now we're using this transportation, which is cutting through the neighborhood. So it's just like, it's that layering is just very interesting on how we use it and how it's modes of use and destruction. You know what I mean? It's like sublime in that aspect. And just thinking about that relationship and moving through that, going to Baltimore, which is Black Flight, and that reference of being in that area, traveling through Baltimore back and forth, and really again approaching an aerial view of the situation. And when you look at that butterfly in the work, it's an overlay of a grid of where pretty much minorities live, where whites live, and how it's shaped like a butterfly, and how the highway came through the middle. But this was different. This was a different way of racial segregation in that area. Like we said, we migrated. When I was younger, we migrated, or we moved up to, going up north. Well, not, Maryland, in that area. And a lot of people did that in the beginning because Baltimore was the first biggest free state, or Maryland, since the 1800s. And everybody migrated up there because it was the closest thing you can get to Washington, D.C. to basically you wanted to be next to D.C. because that's how laws was changed. So they wanted to be close. So we all stubbed and hubbed in Baltimore, became a huge mecca of the Black elite. And the thing about that is why the show is named what it's named. It's the White Rose on Black Soil. It's a statement on how they protested. And in most places, they couldn't bring highways straight through the neighborhood because the African Americans in that area had affluent are pretty much in DC, where the poster kind of originated from, or the name kind of originated from. They couldn't run a highway because we was connected to the government. We was connected to politicians. So we had a little bit of pull to say, no, we're going to protest. We're not going to let this happen. So even in Baltimore, going through, they couldn't break it through the neighborhood. They had to make one line going straight up. And that's where a lot of the whites, pretty much upper class whites, pretty much stayed in that vein or that spine of this area. And then as you get further out, it gets more impoverished because you start lacking on the community. But it's so interesting when you think about white flight in reverse, and it's Black flight going out, and the Black flight is on the wing. So it was like a pun in the name in general of thinking about the area. Yeah. So again, even in the corner, I used that I used the X and used the placement of what happened, what time it happened, the HOLC, who did what, the bodies that's in there, and who came to rescue it, or who really came to rescue us, or what happened, or who didn't rescue us in that area. Why did they let, like, if you look at most instances, the police pretty much let it happen because it shouldn't have happened if the police was on our side as a community. But things are changing, as I say. I just want to bring awareness to the background and the landscape that we live in.
Yeah.
But we still have to move through it. And this is hence why the people started to jump through there. And you go to walking through another experiment, the whole house and process was an experiment. And as soon as the Black people came in there, it became a bigger experiment because they're like, okay, what happens is everybody leaves. And what happens if we charge African Americans more money, pile them over top of each other, because now your grandma, your sister, your brother, your cousin, your uncle all have to live in there so we can pay rent. So what happens when it's a whole building full of 20 people in one room? And then you dismantle the healthcare system, you dismantle housing, you dismantle a lot of stuff in that area. What happens? What does the experiment look like? And then now in this tale, you got people now leaving because we still have to walk through this. We still have to move through this environment. So now we're leaving, saying bye to our family, saying bye to our friends, our daughters, our sons, and going to another environment because we have to keep moving. So what's next? And that's how it continues, because it just doesn't stop in that. When they go to Train Up and my other Walking Tall, those are references across the tracks, across the train tracks. And it's the same reference of when I was an undergrad at Maryland Eastern Shore, HBCU. And I used to drive my car with the lights, all, flashing and everything in there. Soon as I go across some train tracks, everything changed. It gets pulled over by the state troopers, like instantly. because our school was on the other side of the train tracks. Again, historically Black college, segregated by residentially segregated by a railroad track, and you go on the other side and the laws are totally different. So this whole show is about that. It's about my life, but it's not just me, it's about everybody. And regardless if you want to walk through this environment and be not aware of it, it's still our landscape. We're still flatly synthesized in this place without you even realizing. And this is affecting your past generation, and it's still going to affect your future. So what are ways to keep moving through, and what are ways to keep, responding to that? And this work was so timely because it's like one of the biggest infrastructure bills just got passed. And it's going back to the same situation, so just is a lot of thoughts when I was making the work, and still a lot of thoughts going forward with the context. Sorry for going on the tangent.
No, that was so beautifully put. And the history of Black people is really the history of movement and fugitivity and sometimes forced, but sometimes willful escape as well. And I think your paintings really give such unique language to that, as you use the word sublime, and I think that's an absolutely correct choice of language. Even thinking about this image of the butterfly as this beacon of escape and unbounded movement, that you've blown up and magnified in scale in your painting. I think it really is hopeful. It really, the colors that you're using, the forms that you're using, they really tell us and underline once again that movement. It's not always out of our control. It's something that we do collectively to survive, to thrive, and to build anew. So I really am just so in deep gratitude to be able to witness your works and to have been in conversation. We're coming up on 2:00, so I want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions. But do you have anything, Jamaal, that you wanted to add before we move on to the Q&A section?
No, I think this is perfect. This hit a lot of the notches that I love to talk about.
And thank you for such rich and provocative answers, and for being such a wonderful companion in dialogue. It's really meant the world to be in conversation with you today. And once again, just going to encourage everyone who can to go down to see Jamaal's show while it's still open.
Yes.
And I'm sure that there will be many more shows, solo shows in the future, because your work is really giving us a lot to think about. But thank you, Jamaal. It's really meant the world.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for such an amazing and generative conversation today. Everyone here at the Rail knows I'm always over the moon anytime anyone says the words butch feminism, so I'm in it.
Yes, everyone must read that book. It is absolutely paradigm shifting.
If you don't keep it by your bed, I don't know what you're up to. We do have some questions today. Our first question is going to come from my colleague Anya. Anya, yeah, you got it.
Hi, thanks, Chai. Thank you, Zoe and Jamaal. This has been a wonderful conversation. My question is just about virtual versus physical viewing. I'm just curious what you think, or if you have thoughts on what a virtual viewing does to the dimensionality of your works that you've already emphasized the flatness of, going through a viewing room such as the one that Kavi Gupta has on their site.
Oh yeah. I kind of ran, earlier kind of ran away from virtual viewing because I was like, oh man, I use oil paint and you really just need to see the color like in person. And that's kind of how it was for me. But now I'm kind of, it's interesting, like this conversation, it just really made me think about the pairing of like a virtual world even in the work, and then what does that mean when it is virtual in that segment? So I'm kind of still thinking about it. Like I say, I'm doing different, like right now I'm like working on different techniques to kind of make me feel a little bit more comfortable in that space as far as showing work there. And it's like it's such a new thing. I really just want most of the time I just want people to see it in person, experience the pigment in general, because I'm not using an acrylic to make it. I'm using a live substance, a pigment, to utilize these subtle colors in there. And sometimes that the scale draws, a different impact and feeling. So I'm now looking at different ways on how to get that same effect on a virtual level. And I haven't figured that part out yet. So I I think it still plays in a good verse, but I'm still learning, just trying to figure out how can I approach that in a virtual world, which maybe the viewer goes inside of the painting in general. It maybe take another form instead of being flat. Now it's you working in this dimensional world, and then now the viewer can go into the world like a metaverse in that sense.
I love that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you, Jamaal, for your answer. We are now going to go to a question from an old classmate of mine, Brandon. Brandon, I'm finding you to pass you the mic now. I would be faster if you had your camera on. There we go. You can unmute now. I'm going to give him a second. Oh, there we go.
Hey, sorry. Hi, both of you guys. I was just wondering, just real quick, what are you guys reading now, / what's on your reading list? Thanks.
Well, the book I was reading for a while, honestly, for this show, it was kind of dense. I was reading The Color of Law, and I kind of most of the time I read a lot when I'm preparing for a show, but now I'm kind of just in the pretty much in experimental mode, so I'm kind of just really just thinking about the material and the work. But the last book I read was The Color of Law. Yeah.
Zoe, maybe we can ask that question to you as well then.
Sure, yeah. I'm currently in the middle of this just like absolutely wonderful kind of mining of family history called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, which is this kind of tome that navigates between a contemporary story of a young Black woman named Ailey, and then her sort of ancestral history. And so the chapters kind of oscillate between this contemporary narrative and then this kind of like longue durée of the land that her family is from, and generations and generations of family history. It's a really amazing work. And then on my reading list next, I am hoping to actually get through some more of Du Bois's oeuvre after reading this, because he's just reading it has reminded me of what a towering intellect he has. So I haven't yet read Dark Water, so I'm hoping to get through that next. And then I also want to read some of his fiction as well. So that's me.
I love a stint on a particular writer. I run those often.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Jamaal and Zoe, for your answers, and thanks again, Brandon, for your question. We are now going to go to a question from G.E. Schwartz. Hey, G.E., you can unmute now.
Thank you so very much. What a vibrant, amazing, necessary show. Would I be any way near correct in seeing how your paintings sort of are exposing how this all started, how it happened, when it happened, because of the historical context and the sort of time travel involved, and then who caused the deep problems, and also then obviously the complicity of everyone involved who not only let it happen, but continues to let it happen. I know that's kind of a
no, that's pretty much everything in the work. And then I guess the last phase is the people that are moving through there. And this is why the figures most of the time don't have no particular form, because whoever fits in that, whoever gets in them clothes in that environment are part of that whole experiment, are part of that whole structure. So it's open-ended into the form. And then when no forms are in there, the presence of your body is now acting in the space. So now you are part of the situation as well, just bringing awareness to the whole idea. Hence is why I use the color, just to draw people in there to, taste the poison.
excellent. I love it. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chi, and thank you, Jamaal. I was glad you brought up that note about color from the beginning again, because that was something that really I was thinking a lot about, was what you were saying about using the color to draw the viewer in. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking again about universality in that sense as well, which I was planning to ask you about the headlessness, but Zoe stole it from me, yeah. Which of course is her right. And now we are very excited to go to our poet for the day. At the Rail, we have a tradition of closing all of our community events with a poetry reading. And today I am thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Noland, to the stage. Noland is an artist, poet, filmmaker, photographer, and cultural organizer born and working in New York City. Her work has been recognized for continuing the lineage of downtown NYC counterculture. As a poet and vocalist, she has performed in collaborative works internationally. In 2018, she released Authentic Artifice, an art book of poetry and photographs published by Newest York. She is an advocate for prisoners' rights and freedoms, corresponding with and visiting incarcerated artists between Mexico and the US. Take it away, Noland.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is it working? It works. Good. Thank you, Jamaal, so much for your beautiful... I really enjoyed listening to you speak of the images, and just did a little bit of writing while you were speaking, which will be the seed for the larger word painting here. Codes that billow, nomadic dust, glittering poison, symbol of cement, siphoned through layer after layer of flatness, costume maneuvered, butterfly rode on the wing of nation divided, flight by live wire fallen on the railroad track. And a little piece from Diane de Prima. A lack of faith is simply a lack of courage. One who says this seems broken, can't be fixed, is simply a coward, is pleased to be spectator on this scene where there are no spectators. Idle hands diving back into one more pleasure trip. The goddess up all night laughing to each raindrop. Like a wild hyena, the shaman hisses, simmer down. She's thrashing charcoal dreams around the room again. Gluttonous for impossibility, shades of amorphous gemstone. Something about a demon with 7 arms, the lamb god, the 4-colored horses, pale green death, black wine horse. Something about the sun and the moon being hit and split and pilfered for thirds. Something about 666, flying blood spells reclusively around the room, high of a mercurial deceit, a pelvic wound through a halo, a lie threaded through wounded TV. They get their tales from a different well than you or me. The war of reality, not so philosophic when it's the root cause of the blood sopping from the tree of knowledge. The DRS looked like this, with all of them running back and forth across the Brooklyn Bridge, liberty pursued, an orphan sonnet seeking a hermetic kiss in the threshold of mysterious village and hermitage. On the floor of the charcoal studio, the sculptures appear, rising like visions that mutate, threaded braids of holographic color, trip on wire to leaders, running wire to each other across the planet, to quickly devise a plot for poetry, for the poetry of earth in all things. The planet hanging, the air hanging, all aglow disorder in the trees. The planet was understood as a wild garden upon which millions of fences had been lashed, dangerously downcast into the minds and hearts and creatures of spirits not yet born. It's not crazy, not impossible. In the chasing pennies operation, all this could be redesigned, redefined. Not crazy, not impossible. The planet understood as a fat pearl saturated to full spectrum frequency with the shape of bona fide opal hole radiating in stillness, surrounded by the fizz of a radio bloom, static sound building graphic waves or pyramidic translations of bloom, blue-white zap thing, unnameable. And with its hanging, orb-like glows far enough to traverse the earth and disappear all mythic fictions, melting them like wax until they wane, sanctified and smooth, a simultaneous stream pulled like thread around the planet, and its disparities sanctified and smooth. This orbit of fullness, so full it couldn't accept one more poetry, a blueness overcome by sound. New workers keep coming, writhing out of the sea and cement to continue at horizons where the first ones have fallen. Thank you. So nice to see you all. Thanks for having me and for all your beautiful work. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Nolan, for that lovely reading. And thank you again, Jamaal and Zoe. It's been so lovely to hear you guys in conversation today. And thank you, Laura and James from James Fuentes Gallery for helping to make today's event possible. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we'll upload today's conversation shortly. And we at the Rail do this every single day. So please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for our 68th Radical Poetry Reading, curated by Todd Colby, featuring poetry read by Wendy Eisenberg, Lee Ronaldo, and Wendy Zhu. And now you can all turn on your microphone to say hello and goodbye and thank you as you leave.
Thank you for this.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you all.
Blessing.
Thanks,
Blessing.
Noland. Thanks,
Zoe.
Jamal. Thanks, Zoe.
Blessing, man.
Fantastic conversation
Loved
today.
it.
So splendid.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you,
Great
thank
conversation.
you all. It was wonderful. Thank you. I
Thank
always
you.
enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamal. Appreciate it.
Appreciate y'all. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being here.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thank
Take care. And go see the
Yes.
show. The show's on view
Yes.
till the
Oh,
15th.
yeah. Please do.
I'll take a whole field trip. Thank you all.
Take care, everyone.